Earlier in the year, when we were still meeting in person, we went through the basic philosophy of humanistic Judaism, which included how we answer questions of what is the good life, what is the nature of people, how do we understand the truth, and so on. In the latter part, we're turning to questions of our roots. Where do we find our intellectual forebears? Where would we see our precursors, earlier examples of what we do, or even further back up the evolutionary chain? Where would we find sources for inspiration? This is actually, there are multiple levels to this. This is sort of the adult ed version of this. I've got an undergraduate version of this, which is a weekend seminar called Roots of Secular Humanistic Judaism that we've taught for many years. And there's even a graduate level rabbinic class on this that we teach for a full 72 seminar hours over the course of an academic year. So there are many layers of depth we could get into on this question of where our roots come from. Last week, we talked about a phenomenon called Yiddishism, or people who are trying to build a cultural and secular Jewish identity around Yiddish language and culture. And actually, the video for that should be up on the Institute's YouTube channel sometime soon. So if you go to youtube.com/IISHJvid, you should be able to get the link for last week's program on Yiddishis. I do apologize to those out-of-towners who were given a bum link for the program. This is the control freak's dilemma, where you delegate it to someone and then it gets done wrong. So that happens. Hopefully our administrator apologized for his error, but I'm glad to see everyone's here today to talk about Zionism. This is also an important root for our movement, even though the people on the screen, as far as I can see, are all living in the United States. They're not living in Israel. So as sympathetic as they may be to the Zionist cause, at least one version of Zionism, the one that says every Jew must live in Israel, is not activated for the people on the screen. So whether one defines oneself as a Zionist, a non-Zionist, even an anti-Zionist, or a indifferent, I don't care about that question, it doesn't define who I am Jewishly, we have to in some ways relate to the modern state of Israel, and more importantly, the ideology of Zionism as it first developed, because that's where we find our intellectual root. The modern experience of the state of Israel is its own interesting phenomenon, and we're not going to debate every question of what the border should be and how should they treat the Palestinians and all those kind of questions. In fact, that's one of the challenges in trying to study Zionism or have a conversation on the topic in any Jewish community these days, because there's a range of perspectives on the question. Even within our own movement, there's a range of perspectives on that question of whether the Palestinians are a viable peace partner, what would make the most sense to have security for Israel, how can Israel maintain control over the West Bank while still respecting human rights, and so on and so on. For some, even there's Zionism, which talks about national self-determination, impels them to support the creation of a Palestinian state because they should also have the right to national self-determination. So, and all of those ranges are part of our movement. We even get people who question the very idea of an ethnic state altogether. And that applies everywhere, not just to Israel, but to Estonia and to China with the right of return and to plenty of other countries that have privileged a particular ethnicity or religion and have rights of return and other kinds of issues. So there are some people who are consistently non-nationalists, at least non-ethnic nationalists, and they might also find a home in a secular or humanistic Jewish community. So discussing Zionism in theory and as it developed gets challenging because of contemporary political conflicts. But we'll do our best and we'll try to be civil. And if you're not, I will bump you. So keep that in mind. When we think about the origins of Zionism, obviously we have to go back to before 1897. It's before the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. It's before Theodor Herzl. It's before even the pre-Zionist writer Leo Pinsker, who wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation in 1882 in the aftermath of the pogroms in Russia. It goes back to the first experience of exile and diaspora, because Jews were, Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BCE. The elite of the city of Jerusalem were taken into exile in Babylon, but they stayed Jewish and they longed for a return. And when they thought about returning, one of the places they highlighted as a connection was the mount called Zion, or Zion in Hebrew. You can read in Psalm 137, for example, if my right hand forgets you, O Jerusalem, if I ever forget you, may my right hand lose its skill, O Jerusalem. And This is something that's recited actually as part of meal blessings in traditional Jewish homes and communities. So it's reminded all the time. Or think about Passover at the end, when we traditionally would say, next year in Jerusalem, or may he rebuild his temple soon in our days. It was all longing for a return. But it was longing for a return in the distant future, in the Messianic age. It was nothing that you were expected to work for or move there or start a collective farm about. I mean, that whole kibbutz phenomenon is new. That's not the ancient model. The ancient model was religious, pious, wait for God to fix it. The modern movement of Zionism, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about a Zionist ideology or approach, is a response to European ethnic nationalism. Throughout the 19th century, you begin to get this idea percolating that different ethnic groups might deserve or want their own nation. Now, sometimes that was articulated in the form of coalescing large states. So France coalesces as a national entity in the 18th century, in the 1700s. Italy coalesces as a national identity in the middle of the 19th century. Germany coalesces as a national identity. And sometimes they're not as unified as you would think they would be. In fact, I think only maybe 15% of Italians spoke standard Italian at the time Italy declared itself to be the national home of the Italian people. So it was a nation building process as much as anything else. In Eastern Europe, on the other hand, you had large multi-ethnic empires. You had the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. And then you had the Russian Empire in Eastern and Northeastern Europe. In all three of those empires, you had multiple ethnic groups with their own languages, religious cultures, but they were all under the autocracy of a large empire. What began to percolate in the 19th century was the idea that maybe these peoples had a right to their own territory, to use their own language, to have some autonomy, maybe under the control of the empire, or maybe as independent national states. You may remember that the First World War is set off with that shooting in, I forget which, in Belgrade, I think, of wrong city, Lori. Sarajevo, in Sarajevo, of Archduke Francis Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist who is hoping to spark a conflict between the two and expand his nation's territory. So, and Serbia was already independent at the time, but he was still a nationalist in that flavor. So this is the context for the development of Zionism. It's this European concept of ethnic nations should have the right for their own political entity and power for self-determination. And you'll hear that kind of rhetoric when we look at Herzl's texts. Now, what really starts Herzl and the modern Zionist movement moving forward is a famous trial that takes place in the early 1890s. It's the trial of Alfred Dreyfus. Now, Alfred Dreyfus was a captain in the French army. So in fact, he was an example of the success of assimilation and integration. He was fluent in French. His first name was Alfred, not Herschel or Yankee or some other kind of Hebrew name, or Moshe. His first name was Alfred. It was a French name. He was not just a lieutenant. He was a captain. So he had made his way up the hierarchy. And this was in France, the home of the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. It emancipated Jews to be full citizens in the 1790s. This is fully 100 years after Jews have been emancipated in France. And yet, when looking for a scapegoat for their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, they light on Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He is railroaded in a sham trial. Ultimately, he'll be exonerated after many years. Famously, Émile Zola, the writer, writes his letter J'accuse in a public setting in a newspaper, saying he accuses the army and the church and the establishment of covering up the innocence of Dreyfus. You even get France split between the pro-Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. This goes on for a decade, but the initial trial is what triggers Herzl. Herzl himself is like Dreyfus. He's a very assimilated Jew growing up in Vienna. He was a member of a Jewish fraternity in college, but most likely never had a bar mitzvah. Certainly his son didn't have a bar mitzvah. And yet, at the trial, when Dreyfus is taken out in chains and has his sword broken and his decorations ripped off his uniform, the crowd cries out, Abat les Juifs, down with the Jews, down with the Jews. And something clicks in Herzl's mind. He says, if in France, the home of the revolution, where Jews have been emancipated for 100 years, a French-speaking Jew like Alfred Dreyfus, a captain in the army, if he can be condemned simply for being a Jew, then we don't have a home here. This rising tide of ethnic nationalism will not allow us to be citizens. Because if citizenship is not just an abstract legal concept, but it's an ethnic, folk-based, traditional community setting, somewhat like the Romantic movement in the 19th century also talks about the rootedness of the people. You have the beginning of the folk literature and folk stories, collections, Brothers Grimm and so on in that period too. All of this is conspiring to tell the Jews, you're not part of this community. You can't be fully Polish and Jewish, fully Jewish and German, as much as many Jews wanted to be, and as much as some parties in Germany would have allowed them to be. But the most nationalist parties in France, in Germany, in England as well, are telling the Jews, you are not one of us. And Herzl says, okay, if we're not one of you, then we'll go be somewhere where we can be the us. And that's the spark for this idea of creating a Jewish state. I'll actually share with you a little bit of text from Herzl's book, The Jewish State, which is published in 1896. Here's what he has to say at the beginning of the book. We are a people, one people. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves into the social life of surrounding communities and preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property. In vain do we increase the fame of our native land in science and art. In countries we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land where Jews had already experienced suffering. The majority may decide which are the strangers. It's a question of might. It is useless for us to be loyal patriots. If only we could be left in peace. In the end, he says, we have to leave. Notice the subtitle of his book, by the way, an attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question. So that idea of a solution to the Jewish question is not only Nazi phrasing. In the end, he says, the creation of a new state is neither ridiculous nor impossible. We have in our day witnessed the process in connection with nations that were not largely members of the middle class, but poorer, less educated, and weaker than ourselves. He's already seen other ethnic nations find their own territory and political survival and independence. The governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. Well, maybe not. In the end, Herzl's revelation that the Jews are a people, they're not accepted where they live, they need a homeland of their own, meant a break with tradition. Because now he was not just going to wait for the Messiah. Remember the line in Fiddler on the Roof? When they're about to be expelled from the town and they ask the rabbi, Rabbi, wouldn't this be a good time for the Messiah to come? The rabbi's response is, well, we'll just have to wait for him somewhere else. This is a no waiting answer. It says, let's do it now. Now, there are four major streams of Zionism in the first, say, 30 years of the political ideology. The first one is political Zionism, which is the official Zionist organization which tries to get recognition of the Zionist cause from international bodies and major empires. In fact, Herzl went to the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, all trying to get recognition, which happens after he dies, in fact, in 1917, where the Balfour Declaration is issued, establishing in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, and trying to clarify that it shouldn't affect either the rights of the non-Jewish communities there or the status of Jews enjoined in any other country. So political Zionism is the organization trying to get public recognition. And this happens not only in the Balfour Declaration, by the way, which is unilaterally a British statement, but also in the Treaty of San Remo, in the mandate of the League of Nations in the early 1920s. And so there is international recognition of the creation of a national home for the Jewish people as an ethnic national group in the land of Palestine. So political Zionism is one flavor. A second flavor is sometimes called religious Zionism. This believes that the Messiah will come soon. We just have to all be in Israel to be ready for it. And if there are secular heretic Jews who aren't waiting for the Messiah working, that's actually the Messiah using them to help bring the Messiah. So it's okay. That isn't a particular route for our movement, obviously. The two styles of Zionism that are directly related to our movement are, on one hand, what's called practical Zionism, sometimes called socialist Zionism, and this is led by David Ben-Gurion. There is an alternate flavor called revisionist Zionism, which is also, at least initially, somewhat secular and nationalist. But the more radical redefinition of Judaism comes in the socialist Zionist world. And the other, which we'll talk about later, is called cultural Zionism. So the model of socialist Zionism was that you didn't just want to get a territory. What you really need to do is to change the Jewish people. It's not just a question of a new state, but it's a new Jew. They would use phrasing like, to build the land and be built by the land. If you're working on the land, it's going to change you. And so you would create this new Jew where the old Jew was old and bent and passive and a victim and interested in books and making his living by negotiation and middleman. Now the new Jew would stand tall, would be strong, would fight back, would work the land with his hands or her hands even, and would be the assertive model of this new Jewish nationhood. And so an example of this re-envisioning and how it transforms everything is this wonderful poem by Avraham Shlonsky, one of the poets of the early Zionist movement. It's called "Dress Me, Good Mother, in a Splendorous Coat of Many Colors." Some of our communities, by the way, sing some of the lyrics to this. The song is Halbishini. Halbishini ima kashera. That's the Hebrew version of this. But notice how I'll read the poem, but notice how he takes traditional ideas and transforms them into the religion of labor. Dress me, good mother, in a splendorous coat of many colors, and with dawn lead me to toil. My land wraps in light like a prayer shawl. Houses stand like tefillin, like phylacteries, and like bands of phylacteries glide hand-laid asphalt roads. Thus a beautiful city offers her tefillat shacharit, her morning prayer to her creator. And among the creators, your son Abraham, poet road builder in Israel. So notice the model here. The land is like the body, and the light is like the prayer shawl, but the houses, the prayer boxes that are tied onto one's hands is the land. And who is the creator here? It actually uses the word borim, using the divine word for creation, like Bereshit bara Elohim at the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. Here it's the person Abraham who is the creator. And he's both words and deeds. In fact, the word for poet it uses is paitan, someone who would write a piyut, a pious poem. But now he's a paitan solel, a poet road builder in Israel. And toward evening at dusk, Father returns from his labors, and like prayer whispers with pleasure, a dear son of mine is Abraham, skin, sinew, and bones. Hallelujah. Dress me, good mother, in a splendorous coat of many colors, and with dawn lead me not to synagogue, but to toil. This was the model of this practical Zionism, where you move to the land, you build the land, you work the land, you earn the land through your blood and your sweat and your tears, and you negate the exile with this new existence. You create a new language, which is actually an old new language, with the resurrection of the Hebrew language. And most importantly, you are in charge of your life, not the passive victim of fate. So we'll take a look at a couple examples of text from that movement. Skip past Achad Ha'am for a moment. So here we have an example from David Ben-Gurion, who moves to Israel in the early 1900s. In fact, he changes his name. Originally, David Green becomes David Ben-Gurion. And he says in this passage from, again, Judaism in a Secular Age, we must master our faith. We must take destiny into our own hands. This is the doctrine of the Jewish Revolution, not non-surrender to the Galut, but making an end of it. The meaning of Jewish revolution is contained in one word: independence. Independence for the Jewish people in its homeland. Dependence is not merely political or economic. It is also moral, cultural, and intellectual, and it affects every limb and nerve of the body. Independence means more than political and economic freedom. It means spiritual, moral, and intellectual realms. It is independence of the heart. And from this inner sense of freedom, outward forms develop in the ways of life, social organizations, relations with other people. Our independence will be shaped by conquering the labor and the land, by broadening our language and culture, perfecting methods of self-government and self-defense. This is the essence of the Jewish Revolution. And in fact, it is revolting against the past of Jewish survival through passive acceptance. And so Ben-Gurion was more of a maximalist who believed in ingathering all the exiles, in fact, the end of diaspora, that all Jews should move to the land of Israel. As we'll see, Ahad Ha'am had a different vision of it. But this is part of that model of socialist Zionism. And I'll give you an even more extreme example in the work of Yosef Chaim Brenner. And you'll see how this resonates in particular with the secular and humanistic Judaism. The question of our Jewish life is not a question of our Jewish religion. The question of Jewish existence, this mixture has to be uprooted. Here we are among the community, and no way the lesser for not observing putting on tefillin, the prayer boxes, wearing tzitzit, the fringes. The life question is a question of a productive place for the Jews. We are Jews who live everywhere. We are beaten Jews without a country, without a language. The environment of our non-Jewish majority does not let us become complete and whole Jews, like free Russian and Polish friends. The environment of the majority confuses us, eats at us, but we are not assimilating. Our nation is an exile nation. It is sick, it is stumbling. We have to build it. Its willpower is weakening. We should reinforce it. Let's get strong. There is no Messiah for Israel. Let's build strong soldiers who can live without a Messiah. While we are few members of the Jewish nation, we will be stronger than stone. We will increase our nation's labor, its material and spiritual goods. We, the living Jews, whether we are tormented on Yom Kippur, and whether we eat meat and milk, whether we hold to the conventions of the Old Testament, or whether we are, in our worldview, faithful students of Epicurus, that is totally secular, we do not stop feeling ourselves as Jews. We live our lives as Jews, working and creating the lifestyles of Jews, speaking our Jewish tongue, receiving our spiritual sustenance from our literature, working for our national free culture, defending our national respect, and fighting our war of existence in all forms that such a war takes. Now, so much of that ideology can be part of our message as diaspora living secular humanistic Jews, having a sense of self-pride in being Jewish. Think of the Anti-Defamation League and other non-religious Jewish organizations. The idea of living a Jewish lifestyle in our communities. It doesn't matter whether you eat meat and milk or whether you're a total Epicurus, is the Hebrew, the heretic. You are experiencing the riches of your cultural past by drawing from your literature. I mean, this is what we do. We just don't do it in Hebrew, which will be something that we'll have to talk about a little bit later. But this model of the socialist practical Zionism, the creating the new Jew, generally assumed you would have to be living in the land of Israel, because to do that labor on the land, you should be on your own land. To have a community that's speaking the language, you need to be surrounded by people speaking that language. This was one of the points of conflict between the Zionists and the Yiddishists, where the Yiddishists, as we talked about last time, were supporters of something called doikite, of being here and solving the problem here and now in the language they're already speaking, whereas the Zionists wanted to move them somewhere else and get them speaking something else. In the end, the Zionists won in part because of Hitler and the Holocaust, wiping out the heartland of Yiddish. And in fact, they were the beneficiary of that by generating the sympathy of the world to help support the establishment of a Jewish state in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Now, the other model I mentioned, aside from cultural, socialist Zionism, practical Zionism, is something called cultural Zionism. And this was articulated initially by a man named Ahad Ha'am, who didn't imagine that all Jews would wind up moving to the land of Israel. He figured there would always be some kind of diaspora experience, but he thought that maybe Israel could be a kind of spiritual center, a cultural center, where you would have the creative minds living in a Jewish context, getting a Jewish education, even in the secular school system, speaking in a Jewish language, and they could then radiate out from that center ideas that would motivate Jews outside of the land to become connected and, in fact, to be stronger supporters of themselves as Jews, even staying in diaspora. Again, what he articulates here is part of our sense of ourselves. Now, when he says nation, by the way, and most of the writing in this period will refer to the Jews as a nation, again, they mean an ethnic nation, a people, not necessarily a political entity. You can see the distinction he makes here in this letter. You overlook the distinction between state and nation. In the political sense, you are an Italian and I am a Russian. But in the national sense, we are both simply Jews. If you look closely, I think you'll find even in Italy, perhaps in your own congregation, Jews who are so remote from Jewish religious beliefs and observance, it's impossible to suppose they are Jews only by religion, and who yet would sacrifice their lives for their nation, even though they do not know themselves what is the compelling motive. We are familiar with people of that character. Secondly, in another letter, he points out, I do not believe it is the religious associations of Hebrew that have preserved it. In my opinion, the survival of Hebrew is due to love of Torah, teaching, literature, which used to spring from religious faith, but now is the outcome of a national sentiment. We need now is not a literature of devotion, but a literature of Jewish learning and scholarship, so they can find what they need in Hebrew. And then he says, again, religion is not the answer to save Jews in diaspora. Again, the whole question is about how can we save Jews? Herzl's answer is they can't stay in diaspora. They're going to be kicked out and persecuted, so we need to take them out. The practical Zionists as well said they need to leave. The revisionists were even more radical in saying they have to leave now as fast as possible. And in as much land as possible. The revisionists wanted a maximal Israel. In fact, that was both the East Bank of Jordan, what is today Transjordan, as well as the West Bank and what we now consider Israel proper, the pre-Green Line Israel. But Ahad Ha'am thought, well, maybe you can help the Jews in diaspora if you reconfigure what it means to be Jewish. Experience everywhere, it says here, especially in America, has shown the synagogue by itself as a house of prayer exclusively cannot save Judaism. Nor can the separate house of study intended for young people serve as an instrument of popular education. We have to revert to a system which our ancestors used in days gone by to make the synagogue itself the house of study, with Jewish learning as its first concern and prayer as a secondary matter. Cut the prayers as short as you like, but make your synagogue a haven of Jewish knowledge, alike for children and adults, for the educated and ordinary folk. The sermons on Shabbats and holy days was give the congregants instruction in Torah, not phrases of unctuous piety. But the sermon alone is not enough. Reading on Jewish subjects could be arranged every evening. The spirit of teaching must be different. Learning is the key of Jewish survival. You must teach religion on the basis of nationalism, with which it is inseparably intertwined. But when you talk about religious nationalism, I don't know what you mean. So in the end, if it is impossible to be a Jew in the religious sense without acknowledging our nationality, it is possible to be a Jew in the national sense without accepting many things in which religion requires belief. And then at the end, he points out that, again, this splitting of religion and culture is simply separating two parts of the same thing. He says religion itself is only one of the forms of culture, and Judaism is neither one nor the other, but the national creative power. So I hope what you've seen in this exploration of Zionist ideology, literature, and so on, that it really is defining Jewishness as a peoplehood, an ethnic and cultural identity, and that it's one that modern creativity has something to bring to bear, like that Shlonsky poem, re-envisioning the traditional imagery. It's a creative response to the Jewish past. It has meaning for the Jewish present. It applies to both diaspora settings as well as in the land of Israel proper, depending on the flavor of Zionism one is supporting. And it has a lot of resonance. I mean, some of those phrases that we see in there might indeed resonate with us even today in the terms of Jewishness as a family identity and creatively responding to our literature. Of course, the challenge is that Zionism has been, on one hand, among the most successful movements in Jewish life, and on the other hand, made terrible mistakes and had failures in its enacting in real life. You know, this is the theory here. Ahad Ha'am, Ben Gurion, you know, these passages I'm quoting from were written decades before the state is founded. And one of the challenges is you might have nice ideas. For example, all men are created equal. And then you realize there's slavery and Native Americans and women and so on that aren't included in that. We the people of the Constitution, in the United States at least. And the same is true with Israel. They have wonderful statements in their Declaration of Independence that haven't always panned out in actual practice in real life. So it's worthwhile taking some time to think about What are some of the successes of the Zionist movement? What are some of its blind spots or failures? And also how we can relate to the reality of this movement now. You know, those practical socialist Zionists that moved to Israel, they didn't wait for the founding of the state to start to create their new Judaism. They were doing it all along. There's a wonderful archive. If you get the chance on a trip to Israel and you can tell your tour guide, we have to go here. There's a kibbutz in the north part of Israel called kibbutz Beit Hashita, which is the wheat sheaf. And it has an archive there of all, or as many as they could collect, of the holidays and life cycle celebrations that were created on the far left wing kibbutzim that were largely secular. And so they have examples of Haggadot going back to the 30s. After all, you've got to rewrite the Haggadah, because saying next year in the land of Israel, I'm already here. What do you mean next year? Next year, I could drive to Jerusalem. It's a week, you know, it's an hour away. It's not a week. It's not, you know, some messianic age away. And so they had to rewrite those stories and that literature. They were largely secular. Remember socialism's message that religion was the opiate of the masses. They didn't believe in an intervening God. They had already proven that by moving there themselves. So they were rewriting the Haggadot. They were rewriting life cycle events. They were celebrating. They were meeting 3 times a day. It just wasn't in the synagogue. It was in the dining hall because they had collective meals. But it was still a 3 times a day institution. So they were building a new kind of community. And this archive has a fantastic collection of all the different varieties of ceremonies and life cycle events that they performed as part of the rootedness that they felt in the land. So in the state of Israel, as it has formed, has also continued that tradition. There's all kinds of songs from Israel that we ourselves and many of our communities sing. In my congregation, we sing Bashana Haba'ah and Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and Hatikva, the national anthem, and a number of other pieces that help express our solidarity with our people. Even if we are not states of that, citizens of that state, we still feel that ethnic connection to that articulation of a Jewish peoplehood connection. And the use of Hebrew language, again, hits a button for us in terms of cultural resonance. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make you able to unmute yourselves. And let's start by brainstorming first, what are some of the greatest successes of the Zionist movement? And then we'll turn to some of the blind spots and failures a bit later, but let's start by thinking about what were some of the successes of the Zionist movement. And so you're free to unmute yourself if you want to jump in.
Adam?
Sure.
This is Peter. What about the establishment by David Ben-Gurion of the Labor Party? Would you consider that a big success of Zionism?
Well, the question is whether the establishment of the Labor Party is a success for Zionism. I mean, it was certainly a success for the Labor Party for a long period of time. They were the ruling party of Israel for its first, both pre-state and until the 1970s. So its first 30 years or so. It did accomplish a number of goals in Israel proper, including helping to build the state, creating some expectations of social responsibility, National Health Service, those kind of things. It had some failures too, for sure. It got corrupt. It discriminated sometimes against the revisionist Zionists when they were choosing who could get to immigrate to Israel. Its socialist ideology wasn't always successful. The emphasis on agriculture, for example, the long-term economic direction of all societies was not towards small collective farms. You know, that was just not the most productive way to feed people. And so there were some short-sighted moves there as well. And they also tried to maintain this kind of rigid, austere pioneer ethos into the 1970s, but people wanted a phone. They wanted television. They wanted, you know, they wanted some of the accoutrements they were seeing in the outside world. And certainly people coming from Western Europe or from America who had those things got to Israel and said, what do you mean there's 2 channels on TV? You know, that required some flexibility, which they didn't necessarily have by ideology. So, so the Labor Party was to some extent a success for Israel in the long run, but in the end, it had its shortcomings too. Yeah, Joseph.
To me, it's the resurrection of the Hebrew language and making it once again a living language, and the establishment of the State of Israel.
Sure, if your goal is to establish a Jewish state and you do it, check, right? Number 1 goal accomplished. It's very important.
And that's a big discussion now in Israel about post-Zionism.
Right. If the state's done, what, maybe we're over. I had the same experience where I was supporting an organization called Equality Illinois, which was advocating for the recognition of same-sex marriages in the state of Illinois when it was a state-by-state process. But after the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court, I thought, well, what's the point of this organization? They've met their agenda. Mm-hmm. But like many nonprofits, they've reoriented to find new issues that they can advocate for, because they still want to be relevant and still push the ball forward even more. So that's part of that revisioning of Zionism too. And certainly modern Hebrew language, literature, music, poetry, public square, television, movies. You can find all kinds of that creative living experience. And you go to a park and you hear kids running around yelling at each other in Hebrew to play tag. That's something that's almost unprecedented in human history, to resurrect a language like that. Yeah, Ken.
Call from Skype unavailable.
Oh,
excuse me. When I was in the 50s and 60s, I took a lot of pride in being Jewish because of the state of Israel. And it's the values that I attributed to the state of Israel. I didn't know some of the negatives at that time, but I certainly did take a lot of pride.
Sure. No, it absolutely contributed to diaspora Jewish self-esteem, the idea of Jews fighting back. I mean, even that sort of amusing institution of Israeli folk dancing that used to be a hugely popular activity for American Jews. Now, the funny thing is, folk dancing is supposed to be what the peasants have been doing for centuries, And here, I mean, we just started the state in 47. It's not like we have centuries in the land of peasants who are creating these native folk dances, but that's okay. And a lot of the melodies come from Romania and other places, and that's fine. But that was a way for American Jews to feel connected to this broader Jewish peoplehood. And some of them were very proud of this kibbutz life, the social conscience side of Israel. But if nothing else, the idea of tough Jews fighting back was a self-esteem process, certainly in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Other examples of Jewish success? Go ahead, Laurie.
Well, I think that one of the successes was the ingathering of people who were refugees. I speak from a little experience because my great-grandfather, who was an immigrant from Tsarist Russia, immigrated to Palestine in the 1930s and found a home there, which, as opposed to being attacked by the Cossacks, so.
In that case, it would have been the Red and White Army.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this was 1904 when he left, so.
Right. And even afterwards, the founding of the state, you had waves of Sephardic immigration, Mizrahi, Eastern or Oriental Arabic language immigration. Ethiopian Jews have come in there in the recent years, in the 70s and 90s. Russian Jews have come in large numbers. So it really has been a melting pot of creating an Israeli identity out of all these different varieties of Jews. And even on the religious spectrum, the ultra-Orthodox might not accept the state because they're still waiting for the Messiah. They're just waiting for him somewhere else, which happens to be in Israel. But religious Zionism through what's called traditional Judaism, secular Israeli patriots who are serving in the army. I mean, there's a sense of Israeliness that has really been forged as a national success. Mike Lippitz.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is a success or sort of part of a historical question, but it seems there was a certain mythology created about the creation of Israel. I don't know if it was just in the United States or elsewhere. The land with no people for a people with no land. And
well, I'd call that a failure, but.
Well, I'm sorry, but there was certainly a lot of. I mean, I'd say there was a lot. It created a lot of support in the diaspora, or maybe the United States for Israel. I don't know where the sources of that were, or who was sort of propagating that, but you can cut it either direction, I suppose.
Well, right. I mean, the way I'd phrase it is, it was a global Jewish project that was supported by a strong majority of world Jewry. Again, the ultra-Orthodox rejected it, and some even today, the Satmar Hasidim, for example, want nothing to do with Israel. They're anti-Zionist. They even do protests on Israel Support Day in New York against Zionism. because it's so chutzpahdik. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were Reform Jews in the late 19th, early 20th century who were also anti-Zionist because they said we're just a religion and we're citizens of our country and we are not a national community and we don't want to return or reestablishing a state. You can read the 1885 Reform Pittsburgh Platform and it's very explicit on that. So there were some who didn't agree with it, but by 1950, the vast majority of certainly liberal Jews, but even across the spectrum of Jewish identity, were supportive of Zionism and supportive of Israel. Today, it's become even more contentious for a variety of reasons. We actually talked about that in my congregation a couple of Shabbats ago. I did a talk on Zionism today that gets into more of the questions of what the ideology means now. If you want to hear more on that, you can go to the Kol Hadash YouTube channel, which you can find from our website. There's a link, and you can see that talk in more detail. So other examples of Jewish success, of Israeli success, are on the humanist side. It demonstrates the power of human effort to steer the ship, to change the course of Jewish history and Jewish identity. That you can remake yourself to some extent, and more importantly, you can create a state, you can build an identity, and you can fight back against the tide of history. I mean, if nothing else, Israel is a bulwark against the vanishing of the Jews because it's, as one speaker I heard put it, it's a Jew factory. It cranks out more Jews. And by the way, even the secular population in Israel has a much higher birth rate than the non-Orthodox population in the US. And they tend to marry each other. We talked in another sermon I gave recently on the splits between American and Israeli Jews. Israelis report that 98% of their friends are Jewish. Israeli Jews report that 98% of their friends are Jewish. So the chances of them marrying someone Jewish are pretty high, whether they're secular or religious or in between, or crossing the boundaries between those communities. So this is one of those realities that has been a success in creating this Jewish public square and a Jewish population source. Now, let's turn to the other side. What are some of the failures of the Zionist movement? We already talked about that question of a land without people for people without a land, ignoring the fact there were actually people there. And just as new Jewish immigrants were coming in the 1910s and 20s and 30s, large numbers of Arab laborers were moving into the land at the same time and establishing themselves there, as well as the native Palestinian population that had been there. So, acting like there wasn't anyone there was probably not the best strategy. Other examples of failures of the Zionist movement that you might identify?
Well, if I might, I think one of the biggest failures is a failure to define itself in the sense of where do we want to go? Are we going to be a Jewish state, where we have a small Arab population that has, rights? Or are we going to absorb the West Bank and where the settlements are and then take in a much larger Arab population, which in effect would then negate the fact of being a Jewish state? And there seems to be a real divide as to what is the final result that it is looking at. Is it a one-state or a two-state solution? And that really affects what happens with the state.
And those are sort of two stages, two kinds of problems dealing with an Arab population. And the first one they grappled with in the first 15 years of the state, first 18 years of the state, from 48 until 67, they were an 85% Jewish population state. Between the population transfers that had taken place, some admittedly pushed out by the Israeli armed forces and some fleeing as refugees, but not allowed back, and the new waves of Jewish immigrants coming in from all these Middle Eastern countries, you had a state that was 85% Jewish and 15% Arab, but even then, there were issues of discrimination on social residence permits and freedom of movement. Israeli Arabs were under martial law until 1965 or 66, so they didn't have full democratic freedoms. They could vote in elections, but even to this day, there have been Arab ministers in a government when they were under the Labor Party or some other organization. There has never been an Arab party included in a coalition government in Israel. And that's, by the way, in both directions. The Arabs wouldn't sit in the government and the Jewish parties wouldn't accept them. So that's one side of the problem. The second problem came up with the conquering of Gaza and the West Bank in the 1967 Six-Day War, where now you have a population not of 15% Arabs, but if you included the population of both territories, it would be like 40 to 45% Palestinian Arab, both Muslim and Christian, compared to 50 to 55% Jewish. So now that makes that demographic balance that much harder, and dealing with this Arab population that much more complicated. And that's aside from the question at the very start of what you said, which is defining what it meant as a Jewish state. Is a Jewish state a state that's majority Jews? Is a Jewish state a state that runs by Jewish law? Well, different people have different perspectives on that question. And sometimes never the twain shall meet. Yeah, Ken, you want to jump in? And then Peter? And then Ron.
Yeah. One of the most serious issues from my point of view is the split between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox in terms of even defining who's a Jew. And I find that very alienating. So,
yeah, for sure. And by allowing the Orthodox control over who can marry whom and who counts as Jewish, it's created an even more stark split. There's a joke in Israel that in Israel, a third of the population serves in the army, a third pays taxes, and a third works. The problem is it's all the same third. This is the resentment of the secular population that feels like they're doing all the work. And yet the Orthodox have control over religious affairs and so on. Just to give you one example, we have compatriots, secular humanistic Jewish rabbis in Israel who are trying to organize some communities. And if you want to organize an Orthodox community and get government funding, all you need is 10 men to sign on the line as a minyan, and you can start getting some level of funding. To be recognized as a non-Orthodox community, and this applies, by the way, to conservative and reform as well, you have to show you have 200 members signed on the dotted line. You pay the rabbi in advance, and then the government reimburses you a portion of the salary the next year. And it's not under the Ministry of Religious Affairs. It's under the Ministry of Sports and Culture, because the Ministry of Religious Affairs wants something to do with non-Orthodox congregations. So this is, and the Western Wall, and the status of women, and many, many other issues. Peter, and then Ron.
I've been reading the basic laws recently. Was it a mistake not to write a constitution after the 1948 war?
Absolutely. That's one of Israel's major challenges. It has a Declaration of Independence. It has some basic laws they passed, but they don't have a formal constitution. And part of the problem was they couldn't get agreement on what would be the source of law. Would the Torah be the source of law? Would the Torah be a source of law? Or would the source of law be the inalienable rights of human beings? Those are all different bases for creating law, and they couldn't come to a coalition agreement on how to do it, and they never got the Constitution adopted and enforced. And so some of those basic rights questions are still up for grabs in Israel. Okay, Ron, thanks.
To 3 minutes ago when you were talking about the Jewish state and it's 85% Israeli, but what it didn't accomplish is, and I'm going to generalize, the non-Jewish world saying, yes, you have land and you deserve it because you have been persecuted and thrown out of so many countries for centuries, and now you do have land, and yes, you deserve it, because I still have non-Jewish friends who will think they're experts on Israel and go back to the Balfour Agreement, where someone else, who was overseeing that land, kicked out other people to give it to the Jews. And they used it as an argument. Well, it wasn't really their land to begin with, and someone else who didn't really live there gave it away to them. And so it hasn't accomplished where other, like you said, Italy, Italians felt that they deserved their own country. France, just said they deserved their own country.
Mhm.
It was a small majority of people, but nobody's ever said, no, you shouldn't, that shouldn't be your land.
Although it did take a couple of wars to figure it out. You know, Alsace-Lorraine, for example, is right on the border between France and Germany, and they fought a war in 1870 and a war in 1914 and a war in 1939, battling at least not only, but in part over that territory and where it would belong. So
But we were also, I feel, in history, so many, when you look through history and armies, empires went in and took other people's lands, and they fought and won, and it was okay. It was okay to keep the land when you won, but it wasn't okay for the Israelis in 47 to win and keep the land.
well, and it depends on which, you know, political opponent you're talking to, because in some cases they'll accept in Israel in the 47 boundaries as defined by the United Nations, because that was an international declaration. Or they'd accept Israel in the 1949 boundaries after the War of Independence, what today is called the Green Line, which was the boundary of Israel from 49 until 67.
Right.
But most of the international community will not accept Israel in the post-67 lines, including Gaza, the Golan Heights in the north, and
Yeah.
the West
I was
Bank.
gonna say that too.
And
Right.
as people alluded to earlier, there are Jewish state arguments for not defining Israel that way either, in terms of demographics and human rights and other issues. Yeah, Rick, you actually raised your hand.
Thanks. One of the failures of Israel was its creation as both a Jewish and a democratic state, because what that did was that it created an incentive to increase the Jewish population and to minimize the Arab or Palestinian population. And so as the Palestinian population grew, it was incumbent upon Israel to find Jews around the world to increase its Jewish population, whether or not they were ready to actually move to Israel. And so that created some further instability in other countries. I'm particularly talking of Morocco, where I lived for 4 years and studied the Jewish population. And it was pretty clear that Jews, there was no political Zionist organization there. There was the Jews who were brought to Israel were basically scared by Zionist group who came to recruit them, and they constituted the majority of Arabs, of Jews coming from other Arab countries.
Well, there were also hundreds of thousands from Iraq, where they were expelled and under very dire circumstances. Libya as well. There were a whole series of pogroms that drove them out. Yemen as well in the 1940s, it became untenable. So part of the complication with Israel is it's complicated. As I said, there are some Palestinians who fought against the founding of the state. There were some who were simply caught in between the armies and expelled from their villages. And there were others who left as refugees hoping to come back and were never allowed back. But they also were not integrated into the surrounding countries. They were kept in refugee camps when they could have been integrated into Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on. So it's a plague on everybody's house in this case. There's problems in all kinds of directions. Yeah, we're getting close to the end of time. So I'll call on Sherry, and then I want to say a couple closing thoughts.
Just two quick things. One is there is an international agreement that gives Israel that whole area, which is called the San Remo from the League of Nations.
Which I mentioned earlier on.
Yes. And then the second thing is that there have been Jews living in Israel from biblical times that have never left. In fact, more Jews were in Jerusalem than any other time, than others. So at the time when the state was made. So
part of the complication, again, is what gives you the right to a state. On some level, we swindled the Native Americans for $24 worth of beads for Manhattan. That was a very poor investment on their part. But are they going to come back and reclaim it? I mean, sometimes history moves on. Are the Boer in South Africa, are they not citizens of South Africa. They've been there for 350 years. But on some level, they also came from outside. There are indisputable Jewish roots in the land of Israel, but the vast majority of the Jews living in Israel today, if you went back in their family trees a couple generations, came from somewhere else, whether it was elsewhere in the Middle East or parts of Europe. And so, you know, the question of whose land is it and who's rooted, that's part of the ongoing debate that Israel has to grapple with. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is an argument that goes back to the early days of the Zionist movement, that question of, do you have to move to Israel? In particular, do you have to move to Israel to be a secular Jew? Orthodox Jews, religious Jews have survived for centuries in diaspora. But in the new world that gives you the option of being secularized, assimilated, part of the surrounding culture, do you need to be surrounded by other secular and cultural Jews to live a Jewish life in the long run? Or, more importantly, do you need to be speaking a Jewish language and living in a Jewish context and having the Jewish calendar define your life as it would in Israel, where Shabbat is Saturday, not Sunday, where school breaks are Hanukkah and Passover every year, and not just whether the luck of the draw, your spring break falls in that time. I remember I went to Israel once during Hanukkah. It was weird because there was no red and there was no green. It was all blue and white. On the street signs were menorahs. The hold music was Hanukkah music. I mean, I was, out of a fish out of water because I just wasn't used to it. And I can see why some people would like that experience or would argue that to be a secular Jew, it helps to have that kind of context. So when I talk with my colleagues in Israel, in some ways they have advantages in living as a secular humanistic Jew there. They're speaking a Jewish language. They can read historic Jewish literature much easily. They're learning Jewish history in school. For them to go to Kibbutz Beit HaShita is a drive in the car, not planning a massive trip that at this point is impossible given limitations. You have archaeology at your fingertips. When we were there on our trip to Israel that the Institute led in November, we went to visit a synagogue in, I'm forgetting the name of the settlement. It was a Roman town in the north. It was a synagogue dating back to about 400 BCE that was 400 CE that was discovered in the 1990s. And in this synagogue, they had set up chairs and a lectern because a young boy was celebrating his bar mitzvah in this ancient synagogue. And this is, again, a bar mitzvah in a synagogue that was lost for centuries, that was founded in 400 BC with these beautiful mosaics on the floor. And that's a sense of rootedness that we just don't get here. I'm sitting in the basement of a Unitarian church because that's where we rent space. And that's just not the same as being in an ancient synagogue that celebrated bar mitzvah. And in some ways, it's easier to be Jewish there with the holidays and the calendar and everything else. You're being reminded you're Jewish all the time. Now, a disadvantage is that you're reminded you're Jewish all the time. And sometimes that gets, too much. They want a chance to just be a person once in a while. There's a reason why Israelis, after their army service, sometimes go off to Tibet or the Himalayas or the Andes, and they want to just get as far away as possible to get some space from this Jewish stuff all the time. And honestly, I have more freedom as a humanistic rabbi here outside of Israel than I would have there. I can do legal weddings. I can officiate at funerals in official cemeteries, in Jewish cemeteries, where they have to go to kibbutz cemeteries, but national cemeteries, they're not allowed to officiate. It must be an Orthodox rabbi. Many Israelis also have this feeling of, I don't need to do anything. It's the same problem we have, by the way, in Miami and New York City and Los Angeles to some extent. There's so much Jewish stuff and so many Jewish people that you don't necessarily need to join anything. If you're a cultural Jew, you go to the JCC and the book fair and the public klezmer concerts and the movie festivals, and that's plenty. You've got enough. And the other particular challenge in Israel is that people have this idea that the traditional Judaism is the real Judaism. I don't go to synagogue. The joke is the synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox. If I'm going to go, I'm going to go for the real thing. And the real thing is traditional. I don't like it. I don't agree with it. I never go. But if I'm going to go, that's what I'm going to do. It's a hard sell to convince someone to create a secular humanistic Jewish community that's changing some of these texts and that's creating new versions of Judaism. Some of them dig it, some of them like it, and they're game for the experimentation and the creativity. And some of them are living in Tel Aviv, where there's 1 million Jews around them all the time, and they don't need to join anything. So we have our challenges, but we also have our successes. We find that large numbers of Jews are looking outside the rabbinate for marriage, for example. And they want to have a ceremony not in Cyprus and not in New York and not in Europe. They want to have a ceremony in Israel, even if it's not legally recognized, for their family and friends to see who they're marrying, why they love them, and to do it in a creative but Jewish way. And so ceremonies is one of the life cycle ceremonies is one of the places we found a real niche. I think in the long run, we will get these kind of communities, and if nothing else, as a response to the Orthodox pressure that's being put on the secular Jewish population. So in terms of roots for our movement, the lived experience of secular Jews in Israel is one of them. And I think to some extent, the ideology of Zionism, even if we are not ethnic nationalists the same way that Herzl might have been, and we have more commitment to human rights, even if we're more torn on this question of Jewish and democratic balance, we might tip the balance to democratic over Jewish, and we might be uncomfortable with this kind of ethnic self-definition for a state to begin with. Nevertheless, we see some of the positives of Jewish self-expression that come out of it. I do hope, though, that in the long run, whatever the solution might be, we can find ways to talk about this issue within our communities, despite our diversity of perspectives, or perhaps because of them. There was a session that was held at the last SHJ National Conference last spring, just about 1 year ago, on how to talk about Israel with your communities. And if you go to the Society for Humanistic Judaism's YouTube channel, which you can find by searching there, they have a video from that session, which I think is really instructive in how to have these somewhat tough conversations. You know, the difference between the radical Zionist supporter, like the Zionist Organization of America, which is very right-wing and reactionary, and the anti-Zionist Jewish Voice for Peace is, surprisingly, they both make Zionism the key part of their identity. They're both talking about Israel all the time. They're just at the opposite ends of it. And the real opposite is the person who's tuned out, who's indifferent, who doesn't want to pick a side. And I don't think you have to pick a side to be part of the conversation. So hopefully this is just one example of how you can make this part of a conversation and see how we have affinities even if we don't buy the whole program, and some of the cultural and identity creativity that the Zionists put out there still continues to inspire our movement even out here.